The scorching afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the empty stretch of interstate highway, casting long shadows that danced across the asphalt like dark fingers reaching toward an uncertain horizon. Heat waves shimmered upward from the pavement, creating ghostly mirages that wavered and disappeared in the distance, while the relentless desert wind carried the scent of sage and creosote across the barren landscape. The rhythmic thunder of a Harley-Davidson engine cut through the oppressive silence, its deep rumble echoing off the towering canyon walls that flanked the lonely road like ancient sentinels standing guard over America's forgotten highways. Chrome gleamed under the punishing heat as the massive motorcycle carved through the shimmering air, its rider a solitary figure wrapped in black leather that absorbed the sun's fury without complaint. The bike itself was a masterpiece of American engineering, a 1973 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide that had been lovingly restored to perfection, every bolt and bearing maintained with the meticulous care of a man who understood that some things in life demanded respect. The leather seat showed the weathering of countless miles, the handlebars polished smooth by years of steady hands, and the engine tuned to a perfect harmony that spoke of both power and precision. Marcus Washington had been riding these roads for the better part of 2 decades, ever since he returned from his 3rd deployment in the Middle East with scars, both visible and hidden, carrying memories that no metal could adequately honor. The wind against his face, through the gaps in his helmet, carried echoes of distant places where the air had tasted of cordite and fear, where brotherhood was forged in the crucible of combat and tested by the ultimate sacrifice. Today's journey held particular significance, though few would understand the weight he carried in his weathered leather saddlebags, alongside the folded flag that had covered his father's coffin and the purple heart that had been pinned to his chest by a general who spoke of honor and service. The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black concrete that promised freedom to those brave enough to chase it across the vast American landscape. But freedom, Marcus had learned through blood and sacrifice and bitter experience, was a concept more complex than the Constitution he had sworn to defend, more elusive than the democracy he had fought to preserve in foreign lands, where the color of a man's skin mattered far less than his courage under fire and his willingness to die for the soldier beside him. The Harley beneath him was more than transportation. It was sanctuary, a steel and chrome cathedral where he could find peace in the rhythm of the road and the honest roar of American mechanical excellence. His destination today was the rolling hills of Arlington National Cemetery, where Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez lay beneath a simple white headstone in Section 60, surrounded by row upon row of fallen heroes who had answered their country's call and paid the ultimate price. Marcus made this pilgrimage every year on the anniversary of the ambush that had taken Rodriguez's life, carrying with him the small silver cross that had been pressed into his palm by a grieving mother, who spoke no English, but whose tears needed no translation. The cross now rested in his jacket pocket, warm against his chest, a tangible reminder of promises made to the dying and debts that could never be fully repaid. 2 patrol cars had been shadowing him for the past 15 miles, their occupants making no attempt to disguise their interest in the lone rider, who dared to command such a magnificent machine on what they considered their territory. Officer Derek Thompson pressed harder on the accelerator, his jaw clenched with the kind of righteous indignation that came from years of assuming the worst about people who didn't look like him, who didn't fit into his narrow definition of what belonged on America's highways. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, as he imagined the drug bust that would surely result from this stop, the commendation that would follow, the validation of every prejudice he had ever harbored. His partner, Officer Bradley Cox, nodded approvingly as they closed the distance, both men sharing the unspoken understanding that this was going to be one of those stops that would reinforce their worldview and provide stories for the station house break room. Cox had been riding patrol for 7 years, long enough to develop what he considered a sixth sense about criminals, though this sense seemed remarkably attuned to identifying suspects, based primarily on skin color and economic assumptions, rather than any actual criminal behavior. The blue and red lights erupted behind Marcus like fireworks against the desert backdrop, their harsh strobing immediately transforming the peaceful afternoon into something far more sinister and familiar. He had been expecting this moment, had felt it building in the tension that seemed to follow him wherever he rode, the invisible weight of other people's assumptions and fears that pressed down upon him like a physical burden. With practiced calm born of military discipline and hard-won experience, he guided the Harley to the shoulder of the highway, the engine's rumble gradually fading to a gentle idle, as he placed both hands visibly on the handlebars, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that survival sometimes meant enduring indignity with grace. Thompson and Cox emerged from their patrol cars, with the swagger of men who believed their badges gave them license to judge, convict, and sentence based on nothing more than the color of a man's skin and the assumptions that came with it. Their boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as they approached, hands resting meaningfully on their service weapons. Eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, that reflected nothing but contempt and the burning desert Sunday. The heat rose from the pavement in visible waves, creating a hellish backdrop for what was about to unfold. Well, what do we have here? Thompson's voice carried the mocking tone of someone who had already decided guilt before examining evidence, his words dripping with the casual malice that came from years of unchecked authority. Fancy bike for someone like you. What'd you do? Steal it? Rob some poor white family to pay for all that chrome? The words hit the desert air like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread outward in all directions, disturbing the oppressive quiet of the afternoon. Marcus remained perfectly still, his hands never moving from the handlebars, his posture reflecting the military bearing that 23 years of service had ingrained into his very bones. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in combat zones where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. Good afternoon, officers. Is there a problem with my vehicle or my driving? His training had taught him discipline under fire, and he drew on every ounce of that experience now as he faced a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemy wore badges instead of uniforms. Cox circled the motorcycle like a predator sizing up prey, his eyes searching for any excuse to escalate the situation, any justification for the violence he could feel building in his chest like pressure in a steam boiler. Don't you get smart with us, boy. We know your type. Probably running drugs in those saddlebags, thinking you're some kind of outlaw riding through our territory like you own the place. The casual use of that word, that deliberate diminishment of a man's humanity, hung in the air between them like a challenge waiting to be answered, a gauntlet thrown down on the baking asphalt. Step off the bike. Now. Thompson's command brooked no argument, though Marcus complied with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to following orders, even when those orders came from men unworthy of giving them to a career soldier who had earned his rank through sacrifice and service. His movements were precise, controlled, betraying none of the storm that raged beneath his calm exterior, none of the memories of friends who had died defending the very freedoms these officers were now trampling. The leather of his jacket creaked softly as he dismounted, and for just a moment, the afternoon sun caught the small patches and insignia that decorated his vest like a gallery of honor and sacrifice. A Purple Heart earned in the mountains of Afghanistan when shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through his left shoulder. A Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire when he had carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety while under sustained enemy fire. A combat infantry badge that marked him as a warrior who had faced death and emerged victorious. The symbols of service and sacrifice that should have commanded respect from any true patriot, but which went unnoticed by eyes blinded by prejudice and ignorance. Hands on the car. Cox's voice had taken on an edge of excitement, the kind that came from the anticipated thrill of humiliation and the exercise of power over someone he perceived as helpless. Marcus placed his palms flat against the hot metal of the patrol car, feeling the heat seep through his skin like a brand while the 2 officers began their search with unnecessary roughness, their hands invasive and purposefully degrading, designed not to find contraband but to strip away dignity and replace it with shame. Look at this pretty boy, Thompson sneered, running his hands along Marcus's arms and chest with deliberate aggression, his touch lingering in places that served no legitimate law enforcement purpose. Thinking he's some kind of tough guy on that machine. Bet you never worked an honest day in your life, just dealing and stealing to pay for your toys while real Americans break their backs earning a living. Each word was calculated to wound, to strip away dignity, and replace it with the kind of soul-deep humiliation that these officers seemed to enjoy inflicting. But Marcus had faced enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan, had heard the whistle of incoming mortars, and felt the earth shake beneath his boots as rockets exploded around his position. He had held dying friends in his arms while artillery rained down around them, had whispered final messages to wives and children who would never again hear their father's voice. He had led men through hell and brought most of them home, carrying the weight of command and the responsibility for lives entrusted to his care. The venom of these small-minded men could not touch the core of who he was, though it added another layer to the grief he carried for what his country had become in his absence. "You boys are making a mistake," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of authority that came from years of command responsibility and the hard-earned respect of men who had followed him into battle. "I suggest you reconsider your approach before this goes any further." The words were spoken without threat, merely as a statement of fact delivered by someone who understood consequences in ways these officers could not fathom, who had seen what happened when good judgment gave way to hatred and prejudice. Thompson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls and disturbed a pair of hawks circling overhead. "Oh, he's threatening us now, Bradley. Did you hear that? This drug dealer thinks he can intimidate police officers. What are you going to do, boy? Call your lawyer?" Maybe your gang buddies will come save you from the big bad cops? The mockery in his voice intensified as he pressed Marcus harder against the car, the heated metal burning through his shirt and adding physical discomfort to the emotional assault. Miles away, across the rolling desert landscape dotted with Joshua trees and ancient rock formations, a convoy of military vehicles was moving with the purposeful precision that marked all special operations movements. 50 Humvees arranged in perfect tactical formation, their olive-drab paint schemes weathered by deployments in harsh environments, their mounted communications equipment and defensive systems speaking to serious intent and unlimited resources. The convoy's destination was no coincidence. Advanced communication systems had been monitoring all emergency frequencies, and certain protocols had been activated the moment Marcus Washington's name appeared on law enforcement networks. Colonel James Mitchell rode in the lead vehicle, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination that spoke of battles fought and won, of soldiers led and losses endured. He had served under Major Washington in 3 combat deployments, had witnessed firsthand the leadership and courage that had earned Marcus 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and enough commendations to fill a small display case. The news of what was happening on the interstate had reached him through channels that existed outside normal military hierarchy, networks of brotherhood that transcended rank and regulation, and bound warriors together across time and distance. ETA 5 minutes, sir, the driver reported, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism of a soldier who understood the significance of their mission and the man they were racing to support. Sergeant First Class David Johnson had served 2 tours under Major Washington's command, had seen him lead from the front when other officers might have chosen the safety of the rear, had watched him make the impossible decisions that saved lives and accomplished missions against overwhelming odds. Behind them, 49 other vehicles maintained perfect formation, each carrying men who had served with or under Marcus Washington, men who understood that some debts could never be repaid but must always be remembered. These were Special Operations soldiers, Rangers and Green Berets, Delta Force operators, and Navy SEALs, men who had volunteered for this unauthorized mission, without hesitation, because they remembered a leader who had never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, who had shared their dangers and their losses, and had earned their respect through actions rather than rank. Back on the highway, Thompson had escalated his abuse to physical intimidation, pressing Marcus's face against the hot metal of the patrol car, while Cox rifled through the motorcycle's saddlebags, with obvious disappointment at finding nothing more incriminating than personal effects and travel supplies. The Purple Heart metal case, polished to a mirror shine and containing the medal earned with his own blood, was tossed aside carelessly. The folded flag from his father's funeral, presented by a grateful nation to a Gold Star family, was handled without reverence. The photograph of his unit taken in Kandahar, showing 23 faces that had looked to him for leadership and guidance, was treated as nothing more than curious memorabilia, rather than a sacred reminder of brotherhood and sacrifice. "Nothing here, Derek," Cox reported, though his tone suggested this was more frustrating than relieving, as if the absence of evidence somehow proved guilt rather than innocence. "Just some old junk in pictures. Look at this, thinks he's some kind of soldier. Probably bought this stuff at a pawn shop to impress people, make them think he's some kind of hero." He held up the unit photograph, squinting at it in the harsh sunlight, his expression showing nothing but contempt for the faces staring back at him from that moment frozen in time. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the desert wind carry the distant rumble of approaching engines, a sound that reached back through the years to memories of convoy movements and tactical operations, of brotherhood forged under fire and tested by time. The sound was familiar, comforting in a way that reached into the deepest recesses of his soul, and reminded him that he had never truly been alone, that somewhere in the vast American landscape were men who remembered his service and would not allow it to be dishonored by ignorance and hatred. "You hear that?" Thompson paused in his harassment, his head turning toward the horizon where dust clouds were beginning to rise like brown fingers clawing at the blue desert sky. The sound of the approaching convoy was unmistakable now, a deep bass note that seemed to make the very ground vibrate beneath their feet, growing stronger with each passing second, as 50 vehicles moved across the landscape with military precision. Cox dropped the photograph, letting it flutter to the ground where the desert wind caught it and sent it skittering across the asphalt. His hand instinctively moved toward his weapon as the sound grew louder, primal fear beginning to override the confidence that had marked his earlier behavior. "What the hell is that? Sounds like a damn army coming this way." Fear had crept into his voice, replacing the casual cruelty that had marked his earlier words with something approaching panic. The first Humvee crested the hill like thunder given form, its massive presence immediately dominating the landscape as it rolled to a stop exactly 50 yards from the patrol cars, close enough to demonstrate intent, but far enough away to avoid any appearance of direct threat. The vehicle's radio antennas swayed gently in the desert breeze, its armored bulk speaking of serious purpose and unlimited resources. Behind it, the rest of the convoy spread across the highway and desert floor with the precision of a military operation, creating a perimeter that enclosed the small drama being played out on the shoulder of the road. Soldiers emerged from their vehicles with the fluid efficiency of professionals, their weapons not drawn but clearly ready, their bearing speaking to training and discipline that stood in stark contrast to the fumbling confusion of the two police officers. Each man wore the insignia of special operations, the patches and badges that marked them as members of America's most elite fighting units. Warriors who had earned their place through selection processes that broke lesser men and forged the survivors into something approaching perfection. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his boots ringing against the asphalt, with the authority of a man accustomed to command, his uniform bearing the decorations of a career spent in service to his country. His salute was crisp, precise, and directed toward Marcus Washington with the kind of respect that could not be faked or manufactured, the recognition of one warrior by another across the boundaries of rank and circumstance. Major Washington, sir. Good to see you again. Thompson and Cox stood frozen, their world suddenly turned upside down as the implications of what they had done began to sink in like lead weights in their stomachs. The man they had been humiliating, the veteran they had dismissed and degraded based on nothing more than the color of his skin and their own prejudices, was being treated with obvious reverence by an entire military unit that had appeared as if summoned from the desert itself by the bonds of brotherhood and shared service. Colonel, Marcus replied, returning the salute with dignity intact despite the ordeal he had just endured, his voice carrying no trace of the anger he had every right to feel, only the calm professionalism that had marked his entire military career. I wasn't expecting an escort, though I appreciate the gesture. When we heard what was happening, sir, the whole unit volunteered to come. Couldn't get here fast enough. Mitchell's eyes swept over the two police officers with obvious disdain, taking in their disheveled appearance and the guilt written across their faces like a confession. Seems like there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. These officers apparently don't recognize a decorated war hero when they see one, don't understand what it means to disrespect a man who's bled for this country. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the idle rumble of military engines and the whisper of desert wind across the landscape, carrying with it the weight of judgment and the promise of consequences. Thompson's face had gone pale beneath his tan, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the fact that he was no longer standing in direct sunlight. Cox seemed to shrink into himself as the magnitude of their mistake became clear. As he realized that their casual cruelty had been witnessed and would not be forgotten, Marcus walked slowly to his motorcycle, his movements deliberate and unhurried, carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had faced far worse than this and emerged with his honor intact. He picked up the scattered contents of his saddlebags, handling each item with the care it deserved, treating these mementos of service and sacrifice with the reverence that had been denied them by his tormentors. The Purple Heart went back into its case with gentle precision, the metal catching the light as it settled into the purple silk lining. The flag was refolded with military exactness, each crease sharp and purposeful. The photograph of his unit was carefully dusted off and placed where it belonged, among mementos of brotherhood and loss. You want to know who I am? Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying across the desert air with quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it, the kind of presence that had made him a natural leader in the chaos of combat. I'm Master Sergeant Marcus Washington, United States Army Special Forces. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, led men through hell and brought most of them home to families who will never know how close they came to losing someone they loved. He turned to face the 2 officers directly, his eyes holding theirs without flinch or compromise, forcing them to see him not as a stereotype or a threat, but as a human being who had given more for his country than they could ever understand. I lost friends whose names are carved on black granite in Washington, D.C., brothers who died believing they were fighting for something better than what I've experienced here today. I earned these scars, fighting for the flag that flies over the courthouse where you took your oath to serve and protect. Words that apparently mean less to you than the color of my skin. Thompson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, his throat working soundlessly as he struggled to find some response that might salvage his dignity or explain away what could not be explained. What could he say? What apology could possibly address the depth of what had just occurred? The uniform he wore, the badge he carried, all of it seemed suddenly small and meaningless in the face of the man he had just wronged, a man who had served with honor while Thompson had served only his own prejudices. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of military authority and personal outrage. Major Washington served under my command in Operation Enduring Freedom. He saved my life twice, and the lives of countless others. He's got more courage in his little finger than most men have in their entire bodies. more integrity in his worst moment than these two will ever possess. His gaze swept over the police officers with obvious contempt. And you two have just shown the entire world what cowardice looks like when it wears a badge. The sound of additional vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention to the horizon, where news crews and local residents had begun to arrive, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a military convoy on the interstate highway and the growing crowd of onlookers who had stopped to witness this extraordinary confrontation. Cameras were already recording, capturing the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed a routine traffic stop into something far more significant, a moment that would be remembered and discussed long after the participants had moved on with their lives. Marcus swung his leg over the Harley, settling into the familiar comfort of his saddle with the easy grace of a man born to ride, his hands finding their natural position on the handlebars as the engine came to life beneath him. The rumble spoke of power and freedom that no badge or uniform could contain, the sound of American mechanical excellence that had carried him across thousands of miles of open road, in search of the peace that sometimes seemed just beyond his reach. "I don't need your apology," he said. His words carrying clearly over the sound of his engine, cutting through the desert air with the authority of absolute truth. "I don't need your excuses or your justifications for what just happened here. But this country needs to take a long, hard look at what it's become, at how far we've strayed from the ideals that good men have died defending." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembled crowd like dust after an explosion. "We fought for something better than this. We died for something better than this. And we deserve better than this." Colonel Mitchell raised his hand in a final salute as Marcus engaged first gear and pulled slowly back onto the highway, the gesture holding all the respect and recognition that had been denied by the two officers who still stood frozen in shock and shame. Behind him, the convoy of Humvees formed an honor guard, their proud procession stretching nearly a mile as they escorted one of their own toward whatever destination awaited him down that endless ribbon of asphalt. Thompson and Cox stood alone on the shoulder of the road, their careers and reputations crumbling around them like sandcastles before an incoming tide, the weight of their actions settling upon them with the crushing inevitability of justice long delayed. The cameras were still rolling, still capturing their humiliation for a world that was already beginning to judge them as harshly as they had judged Marcus Washington, their disgrace now preserved forever in digital memory. The convoy disappeared over the horizon, leaving only dust and the echo of engines to mark their passage, but the memory of what had happened would linger, spreading across social networks and news channels, becoming a story that would be told and retold as an example of both the worst and best of America. In the end, it would serve as a reminder that dignity could not be taken from those who refused to surrender it, that honor was earned through actions rather than assumed through authority. Marcus Washington rode toward his destination with the wind in his face and brothers at his back, carrying within him the quiet satisfaction of a man who had faced hatred with dignity and emerged with his honor intact, his mission unchanged by the detour that had revealed so much about the country he had served. Behind him, the desert began to reclaim the highway, erasing the tire tracks and footprints as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that mattered. Something that would not be forgotten.